A model is an abstraction of a table in a database and that tells several things about the entity it represents, such as its name, the name of the columns, their data types and constraints, and so on. In this lesson, we're going to build the model of the user entity based on the following table description you should be familiar with if you ever worked with MySQL, which corresponds to the following SQL statement. To create a model with Sequelize, we can use the define method of the database handler that takes as first argument the name of the model and as second argument an object representing its columns, where each key corresponds to the name of the column and its properties to its type and constraints. To define the data type of a column, we can use the type property whose value must be one of the types exported by the Sequelize module, such as Sequelize string for a varchar 255 or Sequelize integer for an integer. To define a constraint on a column, we can use properties such as primary key to define it as the primary key of the table, auto increment to increment its value every time a new record is inserted, allow null to allow for a null value, and unique to guarantee its uniqueness. Note that a model's name should always be defined with a singular form of a word, as Sequelize will automatically create the respective database table in its plural form. So let's create a new directory named models and within it a file named user. Let's now, within this file, import the Sequelize package and create a module that exports a function that takes as argument the database handler created in the previous lesson and that returns a new model containing an ID, an email, and a hash property created using the define method of that handler. Now, in order for a table to be physically created in the database, we need to synchronize the model with the database instance using its asynchronous sync method, which can be used in three different ways. Calling sync without arguments will create the table only if it doesn't already exist. Calling sync with force set to true will first drop the table if it exists and recreate it. And finally, calling sync with alter set to true will check the current state of the table and then perform the necessary changes to make it match the current model. So in order to synchronize the user model, we're going to slightly change the body of the function by storing the model returned by the define method into a new variable named userModel, converting the function into an asynchronous function, which will be useful in a moment, declaring a new parameter representing the environment object from which we'll use the database sync property to force the table to be dropped and recreated upon server startup when working in development mode, and finally making a call to the sync method of the user model using the await keyword that would synchronize it with the database. As a side note, I strongly discourage you to use the sync method when in production, as it can be quite destructive if not used carefully. Instead, if you need to update your database structure, for example, to insert a new column in a table or change a column type of an existing one, I advise you to manually change the database structure using SQL statements and then update the corresponding model within the code of the application to reflect those changes. Finally, in order to facilitate the usage of the user model and potentially any other models we might add to our application in the future, we're going to create an index file within the models directory that will be in charge of returning an object composed of synchronized usable models. So within this file, let's write a module that exports an asynchronous function that takes as argument the database handler and the environment object, awaits for the user model to be synchronized, and returns an object containing that initialized model instance.